Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Mortal Kombat Deception for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, although it was later re-released on the PlayStation Portable as Mortal Kombat Unchained. What you're seeing here is the GameCube version. This is a 3D fighting game and the sequel to Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. It was developed by Midway Games and released in October of 2004 for PS2 and Xbox, later released in March of 2005 for GameCube, and finally saw a release on the PSP in 2006 as Mortal Kombat Unchained, although that version's a bit different. And like Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, it did get released to a pretty good reception. Most people seem to enjoy it quite a bit, and there was a lot of praise for the new features that this game offered compared to the previous game. In particular, the addition of online multiplayer was praised pretty considerably, and it was one of the major sticking points for the GameCube version because the GameCube version does not have online multiplayer. It does, however, have two characters that the PS2 and Xbox versions don't, which are Goro and Shao Kahn, so there is that to sort of compensate for it, but the lack of the online mode did actually hurt the GameCube version in the long run. But other than that, let's go ahead and take a look at this thing and find out whether it's actually better than Deadly Alliance, because Deadly Alliance, when you got down to it, really wasn't a good game, especially when you compared it to its peers like Dead or Alive 3, or Soul Calibur 2, or Tekken 4. So, let's find out how Mortal Kombat Deception fares. When it comes to presentation, the best way to describe it compared to Deadly Alliance is side grade. There are very, very slight improvements that are basically unnoticeable when you really get down to it. The texture quality is very, very slightly better. The modeling quality is very slightly better. Most of the character animations are actually reused from the previous Mortal Kombat, however, so those look pretty much exactly the same, with some very, very slight tweaks here and there. This leads to the problem of a lot of the characters just feeling like they're basically ripped from Deadly Alliance with some very slight tweaks just so they can cut down on actual labor costs. The new characters introduced to this particular game don't really have much personality of their own, and what little personality they do have really isn't very good. I mean, when you really get down to it, a character like, say, Kira is basically just a female Kano, and she's less interesting. And that kind of thing tends to happen with pretty much all of the characters that they introduced exclusively in Mortal Kombat Deception. Their character designs just feel incredibly lazy or straight up derivative of other Mortal Kombat characters, which begs the question of why they would introduce these characters instead of just bringing back the old characters. But once you get past the really disappointing character designs, the arenas actually kind of outdo themselves compared to the previous game. There's actually quite a bit of detail in those, complete with the same effects that you saw in Deadly Alliance, only they've been given a bit of a makeover in that they actually have multiple levels in pretty much all of them, except for a handful here and there. And they brought back stage fatalities for most of them as well, so that's actually pretty cool. It's nice to have those back, and the ones in this actually are fairly good. Although they do introduce a gameplay problem that I will get to more in a moment. But before we get to that, I do have to mention that the graphics that you're seeing in the majority of the game are not what you see in chess combat and in puzzle combat, as well as in conquest mode. The graphics are considerably downgraded in those particular modes, although in the puzzle combat mode it doesn't really matter as much. It's going for something a bit more goofy and ridiculous, and so it actually ends up working out okay in the long run. Because, I mean, let's face it, just look at this thing. It looks like they're bobbleheads, so obviously it's not going to matter as much how good the graphics are in that particular sense, especially considering that it's basically a one-off side mode. Now, it does wear on you a bit in Conquest mode simply because Conquest mode is actually fairly long, so it actually can get mildly annoying in that. But that's more from the lack of consistency with the actual fight visuals more than the fact that the Conquest mode visuals are just not particularly good. The more relevant thing with regards to the Conquest mode presentation being pretty off is actually the voice acting, which in the Conquest mode is frankly pretty terrible.
General Reiko will lead us to another victory. Hail Reiko!
In the other parts of the game, it's mostly fairly serviceable, but nothing more than that. It's pretty much exactly the same as it was in Deadly Alliance, where in the normal fights, you're not really hearing much in the way of voice acting. You get a lot of grunts and screams and yelling and not really much else. Then you move on to the sound effects and find that they're all pretty much just ripped from Deadly Alliance. There's not really any major changes there, which means that some of the sounds are okay and others just aren't beefy enough. The sound effects have a problem of several of them not really sounding like you're doing a lot of damage with the impact of your fists or your feet or whatever it may well be. It would just be better if the more damaging hits had some really nice meaty sound effects as opposed to just having basically the same sound effects as any other strike. And then there's the music, which is, like in Deadly Alliance, very fitting for Mortal Kombat, but ultimately I cannot remember a single track from this game. It works well in the moment, but it all just bleeds together. In fact, several of the themes are pretty much exactly the same. There's minor differences between them, but other than that, the tunes just don't have enough to differentiate them, so half of the arenas actually end up kind of bleeding together in terms of their soundtrack, and you don't really care in the long run. And thus the soundtrack falls into the exact same pit that Deadly Alliance's soundtrack did. It's just not memorable. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this kind of picks up where Deadly Alliance left off, but it kind of goes back and forth. The bit that picks up where Deadly Alliance left off is really the arcade mode and the, of course, intro to this whole game. The intro shows Shang Tsung and Quan Chi actually being victorious as of Deadly Alliance, so Deadly Alliance canon is that the bad guys won. And after they defeated Raiden, they actually turned on each other for the power of the amulet, and Quan Chi wins, but he only finds that the Dragon King Onaga, the so-called true Emperor of Outworld and the leader of the unbeatable army, appears to regain his power, and he proves to be completely beyond anything the combined might of Shang Tsung, Quan Chi, and Raiden can throw at him. In fact, Raiden sacrifices himself and Shang Tsung and Quan Chi in a completely botched attempt to actually defeat Onaga once and for all. And this is where the arcade mode takes place. You're basically fighting against Onaga in order to either defeat him and claim more power, or just to survive, or for the good of the realms, whatever it may well be. Each character, of course, has their own motivations and their own backstory, and while the ones that you've seen from the previous Mortal Kombat games are going to be pretty familiar, the new characters aren't really as well defined, and a lot of them have fairly nebulous reasons for actually being there. And it's pretty much exactly the same as the arcade mode in Deadly Alliance, where you just play through a series of the ladder matches, and then you finally get to the final boss, which in this case is Onaga, and if you beat the final boss, you are treated to basically a slideshow telling you what ultimately became of that particular character after the events of Deception. And while that is still the primary mode of play for this game, what you're going to find is that the Conquest mode has been greatly expanded. No longer is it a series of glorified tutorials, but rather a bizarre hybrid of action-adventure game and fighting game, where you have this sort of action-adventure mode where you're just kind of running around on an overworld map, you're finding hidden collectibles, you're going from place to place, you're seeing the sights in the various realms, and bits of story come up when you actually encounter major characters from the series and end up engaging in the traditional Mortal Kombat fights with those particular characters. And it's in this mode that you play entirely as Shujinko, a character who is introduced in this game as the character who basically brought Onaga back. And that's not spoilers, by the way. They actually just straight up tell you that in the intro cutscene to the game. But anyway, in the case of Deception's Conquest mode, you're basically going through Shujinko's story over 46 years of his life. In the actual fighting mechanics, he's an old man, at least when you actually get into the arcade mode. But when you get into the Conquest mode, you're basically watching him grow over time, you're getting more moves as you go along, and you're watching the story unfold, where you're just gradually seeing Shujinko getting more and more deceived by this character who is telling him to seek out these Kamidogu, which are 6 incredibly powerful artifacts that Onaga wants to be able to basically destroy everything and rule over everything that is left. So once again, they've basically gone with the idea that Conquest sets up what is going to happen in the arcade mode, except Conquest is a lot more involved this time around. It's not necessarily good, but it's more involved at least. Now, instead of going through an obviously glorified tutorial, you're actually feeling like you're wandering around going on some sort of adventure. It's just that that adventure tends to be rather boring. You're just going from place to place, talking to random people who have basically no bearing on anything whatsoever. You can occasionally punch people if you want, but it never really does anything. And ultimately, what you're really playing Conquest Mode for is to first get coins so you can actually unlock things in the crypt, which does return from Deadly Alliance, as well as find the various unlockable characters, unlockable costumes, and of course moves for Shujinko. You see, Shujinko is the only character in the entire game where you're actually not able to do all of his moves right from the get-go in arcade mode. You actually have to learn them all in the Conquest Mode before you can actually use them in the arcade mode. It's a pretty bizarre choice when you start to think about it, and I'm really not sure why they decided to actually go with that. It makes Shujinko a total pain to play until you've unlocked everything in the Conquest Mode. I mean, it's not really like you can get very attached to Shujinko because he's just a really bland character. He's there, he's an okay guy who is deceived, and he wants to redeem himself. Okay, that's pretty much his entire character in a nutshell. He's just the generic old kung fu master. And the new characters they introduce really aren't any better. They're often really bland. In fact, they're more bland than Shujinko. I mean, Cobra shouldn't even exist, for example. He is a completely pointless character. Kira is a completely pointless character. They should have just taken Kira out and put Kano in this thing. I mean, at least they brought back a few fan favorites like Sindel, Nightwolf, Cabal, which is my personal favorite, and even a zombified Liu Kang. But all the newer characters are just not very interesting, and their stories really aren't very well fleshed out. When you start to delve into more of the interesting parts of the lore they set up in this thing, where there's all kinds of internal strife in the realms and plenty of possibilities for exploring new story avenues, but they never really do anything with it. It's just background dressing that sits there and goes, hey, this is a thing. Okay, you're never going to be part of this, but it's a thing. So clearly that means we have compelling lore, right? No, not really. You have compelling ideas that could be interesting as lore, but they never really go anywhere in Deception. And when you combine that with the Conquest Mode's storyline being kind of drawn out and boring, it ends up really not being all that interesting to actually play Conquest Mode. It feels like more of a chore than anything else. Fighting the other characters with some slightly different parameters, like the enemy doing double damage or something along those lines, is really not as compelling as you might think it would be. If anything, it gets more irritating than anything else, and that's partly because of the AI in this game. One of the biggest problems you will encounter is that the AI is bullshit, for lack of a better term. This is a problem that has always existed in the Mortal Kombat series. It has always had ridiculously hard AI for no discernible reason, but when you get to Deception, you find that not only is the AI still bullshit as ever, but they have an incredibly janky fighting system going on. It's the exact same system from Deadly Alliance with numerous tweaks thrown in for good measure. Tweak number 1, you have the addition of a guard breaker, where you can press forward and hold the guard button to actually break the enemy's combo streak, sort of like in Killer Instinct with the combo breaker. Although you don't really get that really amusing combo breaker thing going on. It just says breaker and the enemy goes flying back a bit. And while it is certainly helpful that you get the ability to break out of a combo, particularly when that combo is one of the particularly long ones that certain characters have, you can't really keep doing it all the friggin' time because there's actually a delay between when you can actually use it again. But moving on from the addition of the breaker, there are also weapons on certain maps that you can pick up that do a lot of damage but generally have very, very limited movesets, so they're really not that useful if you're going up against someone who really knows what they're doing. Or even better, the AI, which will basically laugh in your face as you try to hit them with those things, and they just sidestep around every single thing you do perfectly, or they block everything you do perfectly, and then proceed to unleash a massive combo on you and just knock you off the side for instant death. So I tend not to bother with the stage weapons and just kind of resort to using combos and using the environment to my advantage. And speaking of environments, Deception brings back environment interactions. What I mean by that is basically, say in Mortal Kombat 3, you could uppercut someone and they go flying through a roof, and then you'd move to that particular stage and continue fighting. Same kind of thing happens here. You can knock an enemy through a particular wall or over a banister or whatever it may well be, and then you continue fighting in the new area. And they also brought back stage fatalities, although when you do execute those, you don't get the wonderful fatality thing coming up on the screen. In fact, it just ends whichever round you're fighting, so you can have an instance where you knock an enemy back in, say, a massive steel press, and they get completely squashed, but it's round 1. So round 2 starts up and they're perfectly fine. It doesn't make any sense. More importantly, however, apart from it just simply making absolutely no sense whatsoever, is the fact that it is so incredibly easy to exploit the environments and just get incredibly easy kills. You knock someone off the edge of the crumbling platform, for example, they fall on a spike and you instantly win that round, no matter how much health you had, no matter how much health they had. It's actually incredibly irritating to be on the receiving end of that. It's like being on the receiving end of a ring out in, say, Soul Calibur, where you just get knocked out of the arena and instantly they win no matter how much health they still had. It's incredibly cheap, and more importantly, it's actually kind of hard to avoid considering how janky the movement can be. The combat still feels incredibly janky. The maneuvers feel stiff and uncoordinated, they're not really fast enough, they don't hit hard enough, and the sidestepping maneuvers are actually kind of clunky as well. So when you really get down to it, you never feel like you have full control over your character, especially when you will do things like holding the block button and your character will not block because it didn't register the button press. I've had that happen so many times where I actually hold down the trigger button, because that's what that is. The right trigger on the GameCube is actually the block button, and half the time it works, half the time it doesn't. It just is a total crapshoot as to whether or not it's actually going to work. And before you start acting like, oh, it's your controller, DW, the controller is dying or something. No, I've got a brand spanking new controller that has almost never been used, and I've tried it on that and it still doesn't always work. Hell, I've tried it even on a really crappy controller I have, and even that doesn't work, and the right trigger on that just sticks in place. There's just plain something wrong with the input registration. As a result, half the time you feel like you're just fighting the controls rather than your actual opponent. I mean, once you get past the control issues and the fact that they've introduced the breaker and the stage weapons and the stage interactions, what you're dealing with is really just Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, only not quite as polished, oddly enough. And when you consider that this game came out 2 years after Deadly Alliance did, and it's really more of a side grade than anything else, where the fighting system really didn't actually improve, it just introduced a couple of things and said, you know what, that's good enough. Then you realize, well, no, it wasn't good enough. The fighting system needed to be improved rather than simply sidestepped. I was a lot more willing to forgive Deadly Alliance because it was an early attempt at a 3D fighting game and it mostly worked okay, but when you get to Deception, it just feels like they got incredibly lazy with it. And I just can't let that slide. Similarly lazy is when you try to play as Shao Kahn or Goro in the GameCube versions. They have very, very limited movesets, and even though they do have fatalities, they are just really not very good characters. It's like they were included more as an obligatory thing. Hey, you don't get online mode, so here, have a couple of extra characters instead. It's just lazy. And speaking of lazy, there are 2 extra modes that you can play. The first of these is Puzzle Combat, which is also available in the DS version of Mortal Kombat 3, which is just Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on DS. And the idea there is that you're playing a block puzzle, where you just match the block colors and you get a breaker block that will shatter them all and give you points. You also get a special ability depending on which character you're playing. So for example, if you're playing as Sub-Zero, you can freeze the other player's blocks in order to prevent them from gaining any score or anything. It's a mode that's amusing the first time you play it because it has a slightly goofy art style, and the fatalities that execute whenever you win are kind of goofy, but you very quickly realize that it's just not a particularly good puzzle game and you don't really give a crap. It's just kind of a standard puzzle game. The only thing that really sets it apart from anything else is the fact that it's Mortal Kombat themed. Similarly, there is chess combat, where you play a game of chess and every single one of the pieces is a character from the game, and you get to pick your team in order to be the characters that you actually want to be fighting as, and whenever you try to capture a piece, you go into a one-on-one actual fight, and depending on which situation you're in, so for example, you've stepped on the power tile and you are actually defending on that, well, you're going to get a pretty massive boost when you're actually in the fight, or you might get a bonus for being the attacker or the defender or whatever it may well be. And it's well, it's chess with a Mortal Kombat theme. The only thing that's slightly different from most other chess games is that you get a sorcerer character, which you can use to actually cast spells. Things like teleporting certain pieces to certain locations, or killing off certain pieces, or any number of things like that. And they're all single-use spells, so you can only use them once and then you're done for the rest of that particular game. Chess combat loses steam extremely quickly. You might play 1 or 2 matches before you decide, hey, this is actually kind of boring, I would just rather play the normal fighting game. Especially if you're playing against the AI, which is total BS. So what you're ultimately left with when you play Mortal Kombat Deception is a game that doesn't really build all that much on Deadly Alliance. It's more of a side grade. You throw in a few extra mechanics that don't really help the game out all that much, overhaul Conquest Mode to be something remotely resembling an action-adventure game, and then also throw in a couple of really gimmicky side modes that are going to lose steam incredibly quickly. That's not to say it doesn't do things well. I mean, the fatalities are far superior in this to Deadly Alliance. They're just way better. There's 2 of them per character, and they introduce a third fatality kind of thing, which is known as the Harakiri, where if you're the loser, you can actually execute the Harakiri and prevent the enemy from performing a fatality on you. It's pretty stupid, but you can do it. In fact, a lot of the time you're playing the arcade mode, the AI just decides to perform Harakiris on you before you even have a chance to try to put in any button inputs for a fatality. It's actually kind of insulting. And it's pretty indicative of what the 3D era of Mortal Kombat really became about once you got past Deadly Alliance. It got more and more gimmicky as it went on. Mortal Kombat Armageddon, for example, had create a fatality and create a character, and it had a stupidly huge roster. Then you get to Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, and, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. But those are, of course, things that I will get to once I replace my dead Xbox. Deception itself, on the other hand, is just not a good game. Once you get past the Mortal Kombat aesthetic, what you're left with is an incredibly weak 3D fighting game that was surpassed years before it was released. I mean, hell, Deadly Alliance was surpassed by games that came out before it as well, but at least they came out basically that year. In this particular case, they had come out years before, and they were still better games than this. Just better fighting games in general, better 3D fighting games. And this thing relies way too much on gimmicks and not enough on really solid core gameplay. And that's really its major downfall. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.